The air on the 35th floor of the Spire San Diego was thick, heavy with the sharp, metallic tang of spent gunpowder. Ali Abulban stood amidst the silence of a luxury living room, a man whose face was a familiar comfort to millions of followers, now a ghost in his own life. On the floor lay his wife, Anna, and her friend, Rayburn Barron, their futures erased in a flurry of lead. Minutes later, the man known as Gin Kid was at his daughter's school, picking her up with a calm that defied the carnage. He told his mother over the phone that he had ended his wife's life, a digital star finally recording a reality he couldn't edit out. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Ali Abulban did not just want to be seen, he wanted to be worshipped. To understand the bloody conclusion of his story, one must first look at the meticulously crafted digital monument he built for himself. Born in 1992, Ali grew up in a world that was rapidly shifting toward the screen, and he found his calling in the art of imitation. He was a man of 1,000 voices, a human chameleon who could shift from the gravelly tones of Al Pacino's Tony Montana to the stilted, uncanny dialogue of a non-player character from a video game. By the time he reached his late 20s, he had found his stage on TikTok under the handle Gin Kid. His content was a specific kind of genius that resonated with millions. He specialized in Skyrim and real-life parodies, videos where he mimicked the jerky movements, repetitive dialogue, and awkward physics of the famous role-playing game. To his followers, he was a source of endless entertainment, a creative force who seemed to possess a boundless reservoir of energy. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was a creator with nearly 1 million followers, a man whose likes were counted in the tens of millions. Every notification on his phone was a hit of dopamine, a digital confirmation that he was the center of the universe. But the Gin Kid persona was a shell, a brightly colored mask hiding a psyche that was beginning to rot under the pressure of its own vanity. Behind the scenes, the man who made millions laugh was becoming a volatile, controlling presence in the life of his wife, Anna Abulban. The two had met years earlier, their relationship beginning in a whirlwind of young love and shared ambition. Anna was vibrant, beautiful, and possessed a quiet strength that Ali initially found grounding. They married and eventually had a daughter, creating a family unit that on social media looked like the ultimate success story. The move to San Diego was supposed to be the coronation of their new life. They settled into the Spire, a gleaming glass and steel luxury apartment complex in the East Village, where the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city they intended to conquer. To the world, they were the Ia couple, the charismatic content creator and his stunning wife. But as Ali's fame grew, so did his hunger for control. He began to view his life through the same lens as his videos. Everything had to be scripted. Everything had to be under his direction. Ali's transition from a mimic to a monster was fueled by a toxic cocktail of sudden wealth, ego, and substance abuse. He began to lean heavily on cocaine, a drug that amplified his natural intensity into a jagged, unpredictable paranoia. The high-rise apartment, once a symbol of their achievement, became a gilded cage for Anna. Ali wasn't just checking her phone, he was auditing her existence. He became obsessed with the idea that she was unfaithful. Convinced that her beauty, the very thing he bragged about to his followers, was a weapon she was using against him. The cracks in the facade weren't just internal. Ali's behavior started to spill over into the public eye. There were reports of domestic disturbances, of neighbors hearing the muffled sounds of shouting through the thick walls of the Spire. The Gin Kid was losing his grip on the narrative. In his mind, he was a superstar, a man who deserved total devotion. In reality, he was becoming a domestic abuser who couldn't handle a world that didn't revolve around his ego. He began to treat Anna not as a partner, but as a piece of property that was malfunctioning. If she went out with friends, he demanded a play-by-play of her evening. If she didn't answer a text within seconds, he would spiral into a rage. He was a man who spent his days imitating others, yet he seemed to have no understanding of how to be a human being to the woman he claimed to love. He was obsessed with his brand, and in his twisted logic, Anna's growing independence was a threat to that brand. By late 2021, the digital celebrity was effectively living a double life. On camera, he was still the energetic, hilarious Gin Kid, posting videos that racked up hundreds of thousands of views. Off camera, he was a man who stayed up for days in a cocaine-induced haze, pacing the 35th floor apartment, listening for whispers that weren't there. He was convinced that the world was trying to take what was his. The tragedy of Ali Abulban is rooted in this fundamental disconnect. He had spent so much time curating a version of himself for the masses that he began to believe his own hype. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the rules of basic human decency didn't apply to a man of his stature. As his marriage crumbled, he didn't see a woman who was hurting or a child who was witnessing a nightmare. He saw a rebellion that needed to be crushed. He was the director of his own life, and he was ready to write a final, violent act to ensure that no one else could ever claim the spotlight he felt belonged solely to him. To understand the roots of the tragedy that would eventually stain the ivory floors of a San Diego high-rise, one must look back to the mid-Atlantic coast, back to a time when the name Gin Kid was nothing more than a private joke and the world had not yet been invited into the Abulban household. It was in the Virginia and Maryland area, roughly 8 years before the final curtain call, that Ali Abulban first crossed paths with Anna Marie. At the time, she was a young woman whose presence was described by friends as magnetic, possessing a warmth that seemed to instinctively fill the cold gaps in Ali's often volatile personality. To Ali, Anna wasn't just a partner, she was a witness to the greatness he was certain he would one day achieve. The early years of their relationship were characterized by the kind of intense, suffocating romance that often precedes a storm. Ali was a man who lived for the reaction, the laugh, the gasp, the applause, and in Anna, he found his most dedicated audience. She supported his early forays into comedy, helping him film low-budget skits in their modest apartment, oblivious to the fact that she was helping build the very platform that would eventually become her prison. Their wedding in 2017 was a celebration of two people who seemed destined for a larger stage. When their daughter was born, it appeared as though the final piece of the traditional American dream had snapped into place. But the foundation was already beginning to crack under the weight of Ali's burgeoning ego. By 2020, as the world retreated behind screens, Ali's digital persona began to explode. The more the likes poured in, the more he began to treat his home life as an extension of his content. He was no longer just a husband, he was a brand. Anna, who had once been his co-pilot, found herself relegated to the role of a background character, a prop in the Gin Kid show. The move to San Diego in early 2021 was framed as a fresh start, a coronation of their success. They chose the Spire San Diego, a luxury skyscraper in the heart of the East Village, where the rent alone was a staggering figure that demanded a constant stream of viral content to maintain. Life on the 35th floor was a study in chrome, glass, and curated deception. From the outside, the Abulbans were living the life millions of TikTok users envied. They were young, wealthy, and beautiful. But inside that glass tower, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly toxic. Ali had begun to descend into a heavy, frequent use of cocaine, a habit that turned his natural intensity into a jagged, relentless paranoia. He began to accuse Anna of wanting to sabotage his career, claiming that her growing desire for a social life outside of his shadow was a sign of impending betrayal. The dynamic between them shifted from love to a high-stakes psychological game of cat and mouse. Ali grew obsessed with his wife's appearance, yet he loathed the attention it brought her from others. He began to monitor her movements with the precision of a private investigator. Every time she left their luxury apartment to meet friends, he would demand a live location update. If she was 5 minutes late, the quiet hum of their high-end appliances would be shattered by his accusations. He told her that she was nothing without him, that her lifestyle, her friends, and even her identity were gifts he had bestowed upon her through his hard work and fame. Anna, however, was beginning to wake up from the dream. The vibrant social scene of San Diego provided her with a perspective she had lacked in the insular world they had occupied in Virginia. She began to forge friendships with people who saw her as Anna, not just the wife of a TikTok star. One of these people was Rayburn Barron, a kind-hearted man who would eventually find himself caught in the crosshairs of Ali's delusion. As Anna began to pull away, seeking a life that wasn't defined by a ring light, Ali's control tightened until it became physical. In the months leading up to the end, the police were called to the Spire on multiple occasions. Neighbors reported the sounds of a woman's distress, the heavy thud of furniture hitting the floor, and the unmistakable manic shouting of a man who had lost his grip on reality. During one of these incidents, Ali allegedly pushed Anna, leaving her bruised and terrified. He told the responding officers that he was the victim, that the pressure of being a public figure was being weaponized against him by a wife who didn't understand the weight of his crown. The psychological depth of Ali's descent was rooted in a terrifying form of main character syndrome. He had spent so much time imitating NPCs, non-player characters, that he began to view everyone in his real life as exactly that, scripted entities meant to serve his narrative. When Anna refused to follow the script, he didn't see a woman in pain. He saw a glitch in his reality that needed to be fixed. He began to tell his friends that Anna was gaslighting him, a term he used to describe her simple refusal to accept his version of the truth. The relationship had become a cycle of explosive violence followed by lavish, hollow apologies. Ali would buy her expensive gifts, jewelry, clothes, luxury dinners, using the same money earned from the videos she had helped him create. It was a closed loop of manipulation. He believed that as long as the bank account was full and the follower count was rising, he had a right to her soul. But the air in San Diego was different than Virginia. It was clearer. and Anna was finally starting to see the man behind the voices for what he truly was: a fragile, dangerous child with a $1 million audience. As summer turned to fall in 2021, the tension inside the Spire reached a boiling point. The luxury of their surroundings, the infinity pool, the 24-hour concierge, the designer finishes, served only to highlight the ugliness of their domestic life. Anna began to mention the word divorce, a word that Ali perceived as a death sentence for his public image. In his mind, a Jinn Kid divorce would be a stain on his brand, a narrative failure he could not allow. He began to tell her that he would never let her go, that they were tied together by blood and by the digital empire they had built. He didn't realize that by trying to hold on so tight, he was crushing the very thing he claimed to value. The cocaine continued to fuel his sleepless nights, nights he spent pacing the floor of their living room, staring at the glittering lights of San Diego below, convinced that Anna was out there somewhere, laughing at him. He began to hear things: whispers in the vents, imaginary conversations through the walls. He was a man who had mastered the art of voice, but he had lost the ability to listen to the one person who truly mattered. The stage was set, the audience was waiting, and Ali Abulban was about to give the most horrific performance of his life. By the beginning of October 2021, the thin veneer of the Jinn Kid success story had not just cracked, it had effectively dissolved into a series of police reports and frantic late-night calls for help. The luxury high-rise at the Spire San Diego, which was once meant to be the pinnacle of their achievement, had transformed into a sterile, high-altitude arena for Ali Abulban's worsening psychosis. The descent was no longer a slow slide. It was a freefall, fueled by a relentless consumption of cocaine and a fragile ego that was being crushed by the reality that his wife, Anya, was finally reclaiming her own life. The turning point occurred in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, when Anna made the harrowing decision that she could no longer live in the shadow of a man who treated her like a failing piece of digital property. She had finally gathered the courage to tell Ali that the marriage was over. It wasn't a negotiation, it was an eviction. For a man who viewed himself as the main character of every room he entered, being told to leave his own castle was an insult he could not process. He was forced to move into a nearby motel, a transition that felt like a humiliating demotion. From the 35th floor view of the Pacific Ocean to the flickering neon lights and stained carpets of a budget room, Ali felt his world shrinking. In that motel room, the silence was Ali's greatest enemy. Without the constant presence of Anna to monitor, his paranoia reached a fever pitch. He spent his days and nights in a drug-induced state of hypervigilance, scrolling through her social media, analyzing every like and every new follower as if they were coded messages of betrayal. He was convinced that the moment he stepped out of the Spire, Anna had invited the world in. Specifically, a man he had fixated on as his primary rival for her affection, Rayburn Barron. Ali's obsession with control took a chilling technological turn. He wasn't just a content creator, he was a man who understood how to manipulate digital interfaces. In a move that stripped away any remaining shred of his humanity, Ali decided to use their 5-year-old daughter as a tool for his espionage. During one of his scheduled visits with the child, he took her iPad, a device meant for games and cartoons, and secretly installed a high-end listening application. He hid the icon in a nested folder, ensuring that when the child returned to the apartment, Ali would have an open ear on the 35th floor. This wasn't just spying, it was a digital haunting. From his motel room, Ali would sit for hours with headphones clamped to his ears, listening to the ambient sounds of the home he had been kicked out of. He listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the muffled sounds of the television, and the distant laughter of his daughter. He was waiting for the sound of a voice that didn't belong, a male voice. Every creak of the floorboards was magnified through the app, sending him into a frantic state of rage. He began to keep a notebook of timestamps documenting what he perceived to be proof of Anna's infidelity, though most of it was nothing more than the ordinary sounds of a woman finally breathing in a house without a monster. The psychological toll of this constant surveillance was immense. Ali stopped sleeping entirely. He was a man possessed by the very technology that had made him famous. He began to record the audio he was hearing, playing it back and slowing it down, searching for whispers that likely didn't exist. He told his few remaining confidants that he was gathering evidence for a divorce, but his tone suggested something far more permanent. He was no longer trying to win Anna back. He was preparing to punish her for the crime of being happy without him. On the morning of October 21st, the iPad spy finally gave Ali exactly what he had been looking for. Through the speakers of his phone, he heard the unmistakable sound of Anna laughing, but she wasn't alone. He heard a man's voice, Rayburn Barron. The two were in the living room, talking and laughing in a way that suggested a comfort and intimacy that Ali had long ago destroyed in his own relationship. To Ali, this wasn't just a conversation, it was a direct assault on his masculinity. He didn't see two people enjoying a quiet afternoon. He saw two intruders in his kingdom, mocking his downfall. The cocaine in his system turned his anger into a cold, mechanical resolve. He didn't call the police. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't even yell into the phone. Instead, he grabbed his keys and a loaded handgun. He drove toward the spire with the focused intensity of a man on a mission, his mind replaying the audio he had just heard on a loop. The drive from the motel to the East Village was short, but in those few minutes, Ali Abulban ceased to be a father or a husband. He was a man who had decided that if he couldn't control the narrative of his life, he would simply end the story altogether. The security of the spire was supposed to be impenetrable, a selling point for the wealthy residents who valued their privacy. But Ali still had his key fob. He moved through the lobby with the practiced ease of a resident, avoiding eye contact with the concierge, his heart hammering against his ribs in a syncopated rhythm with the drug-induced tremors in his hands. He stepped into the elevator, the same elevator where he had filmed countless lighthearted videos for his followers, and pressed the button for the 35th floor. As the elevator ascended, Ali stared at his reflection in the polished chrome doors. He looked like the man millions of people admired, but the eyes looking back were hollowed out by days of stimulant abuse and a singular murderous purpose. He was convinced that he was the victim. In his warped reality, Anna was the one who had committed the ultimate violence by moving on. He felt a sense of righteous indignation as the elevator chimed, signaling his arrival at the 35th floor. He stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway. He could hear his own breathing, heavy and ragged. He walked toward apartment 3502, the fob in his hand cold and heavy. He hesitated for only a second before swiping the card. The electronic lock clicked, a small, sharp sound that echoed like a starter pistol in the hallway. The door swung open, and the bright afternoon sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows momentarily blinded him, but he didn't need to see. He could hear them. They were right there, in the living room, unaware that the digital ghost they had been living with for the last week had finally manifested in the flesh. Ali entered the room not as a man looking for answers, but as a predator who had already decided on the outcome. The space was exactly as he remembered it, yet entirely different because he was no longer the center of it. He saw Anna and Rayburn on the couch, their expressions shifting in a heartbeat from relaxed companionship to sheer, unadulterated terror. In that moment, Ali realized that no amount of TikTok fame or celebrity impressions could prepare a person for the raw, visceral reality of a man standing in your living room with a gun. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to hear their explanations. He wanted to hear the sound of the gun, the only voice he had left that anyone was forced to listen to. The descent was complete. The man who had spent his life mimicking others had finally found a role he couldn't walk away from. He was the villain of his own story, and as he raised the weapon, he felt a perverse sense of clarity. For the first time in weeks, the voices in the vents were silent. The only thing left was the sound of the hammer cocking back and the realization that once the trigger was pulled, there would be no redo button, no editing suite to fix the carnage he was about to unleash. The silence of apartment 3502 was not broken by a shout or a plea, but by the mechanical, rhythmic succession of gunfire. When Ali Abulban stepped into that sun-drenched living room on the afternoon of October 21st, 2021, he wasn't looking for a confession or an apology. Through the hidden app on his daughter's iPad, he had already played the role of the judge and jury from his motel room. Now, he had arrived to be the executioner. Anna and Rayburn Barron were seated on the sofa, caught in a moment of mundane human connection that Ali's drug-addled mind had twisted into a grand betrayal. The transition from the peaceful hum of a San Diego afternoon to a state of absolute carnage took only seconds. Ali raised the handgun, a tool of finality he had brought specifically to end the script he could no longer control. He fired first at Rayburn, the man he had cast as the antagonist in his mental drama. 3 bullets struck Barron in the upper body and head, the velocity of the rounds throwing him back as the life left him instantly. Then Ali turned the barrel toward the woman he had once promised to protect. Anna, the mother of his child and the witness to his rise, was now just a target. He fired a single devastating shot that struck her directly in the forehead. There was no hesitation, no flicker of the Jin Kid charm, only the cold, blank stare of a man who had completely devalued human life in favor of his own ego. As they slumped onto the floor, the metallic scent of blood began to compete with the smell of gunpowder in the high-rise air. What followed was perhaps the most chilling display of Ali's psychological detachment. Instead of fleeing in a panic or collapsing in remorse, he reached for his phone, not to call for help, but to document the scene. He stood over the bodies and recorded a video of the aftermath, a final, gruesome upload that he would later send to his mother. In his mind, he was still the cinematographer of his own life, and this was the climactic scene that proved he had won back his honor. He exited the apartment, the door clicking shut behind him on a room full of ghosts. He moved through the luxury hallways of the spire with a surreal, adrenaline-fueled calm. He took the elevator down, passing through the lobby where residents and staff went about their day, oblivious to the fact that a double execution had just taken place 35 floors above their heads. Ali got into his car and drove, but his destination wasn't a hiding spot. It was his daughter's elementary school. The image of Ali Abulban picking up his 5-year-old daughter while the blood of her mother was still fresh on his mind is a detail that haunts the investigators to this day. He greeted her, buckled her into her seat, and began to drive down the California highway as if they were merely headed for a typical afternoon snack. During this drive, the Jin Kid mask began to slip into a different kind of performance, the confession. He called his mother and told her, in no uncertain terms, that he had killed Anna. He wasn't crying. He was explaining it as if it were a necessary business transaction. He also called Anna's phone, leaving a voicemail that swung wildly between feigned concern and a final bitter goodbye, knowing full well she would never hear it. This was the behavior of a man who had lived so long for an audience that he couldn't stop performing even when there were no cameras rolling. He was creating a narrative for himself, one where he was the tragic hero pushed to the edge by a cheating wife. While Ali drove, the discovery at the spire was already unfolding. A family member, concerned by a lack of response, had contacted the building's security. When the police finally entered the apartment, they found a scene that looked more like a movie set than a home. The contrast between the high-end decor and the visceral reality of the bodies on the floor was stark. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture or broken glass, only the silent evidence of a targeted clinical assassination. By the time the San Diego Police Department issued a be-on-the-lookout BOLO alert, Ali was miles away, yet his trail was screaming with digital signals. His phone's GPS, the very tool he had used to track Anna, was now tracking him. His daughter sat in the back seat, unaware that her world had been incinerated by the man behind the wheel. When the police cruisers finally caught up to his vehicle on the I-805, Ali didn't engage in a high-speed chase. He pulled over, almost as if he were waiting for the next scene to begin. He was taken into custody without incident, his daughter whisked away by officers who struggled to comprehend how a man could commit such an act and then go play the role of a doting father. Back at the station, Ali began to talk. He didn't ask for a lawyer immediately. He wanted to tell his version of the truth. He spoke about the cocaine, the betrayal, and the voices he had heard through the iPad. He told the detectives that he had done it for his family, a statement so paradoxical it left the room in a stunned silence. He was a man who had mastered the art of voice, but in that interrogation room, the only voice that mattered was the one he had permanently silenced on the 35th floor. The investigation was swift because Ali had left nothing to chance. The murder weapon was found in the car, and the digital forensic teams quickly recovered the iPad spy app and the video he had recorded of the bodies. It was a slam-dunk case for the prosecution, but for the community of San Diego and the millions of followers online, the shock was only beginning to settle in. The man who made them laugh was a cold-blooded killer, and the likes they had given him now felt like fuel for a fire that had consumed 2 innocent lives. The investigation into the high-rise bloodbath at the Spire San Diego began not with a detective's hunch, but with the cold, unblinking eyes of digital forensics. As the crime scene investigators stepped over the threshold of apartment 3502, they entered a world where the physical and the virtual had collided with fatal force. The primary task for the San Diego Police Department was to reconstruct the final moments of Anna Abulban and Rayburn Barron, and they soon realized that the killer had left behind a breadcrumb trail made of data packets and cellular signals, while the physical evidence, the spent shell casings and the biological remains, told the story of what happened. It was Ali Abulban's own devices that would reveal the calculated how. The most chilling discovery came early in the sweep of the apartment. Investigators recovered an iPad belonging to the Abulban's 5-year-old daughter. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical child's device, filled with educational apps and colorful games. However, a deep dive by the department's cyber crimes unit revealed a sophisticated listening application hidden deep within a nested folder of harmless icons. This was the digital ear that Ali had used to haunt his own home. The logs from the application showed that Ali had been accessing the microphone remotely for days, listening in on the private conversations of his estranged wife. He had turned a toddler's toy into a tool of high-tech espionage, effectively living inside the walls of the apartment even while he was physically barred from the premises. This discovery shifted the entire nature of the investigation. This wasn't a crime of sudden passion or a spontaneous argument that spiraled out of control. The presence of the spyware proved premeditation. Ali hadn't just snapped when he walked through the door. He had been stalking the couple through the ether, waiting for a specific audio cue to trigger his violent response. The prosecution would later use this to dismantle any defense claim of temporary insanity or a heat-of-the-moment reaction. Every time Ali logged into that app, he was making a conscious choice to feed his obsession, building a mental case against his wife that only he could hear. Beyond the iPad, the detectives turned their attention to the Jinn Kid himself. In the hours following his arrest, Ali was surprisingly loquacious. He didn't just confess to the shooting, he attempted to justify it with a terrifying degree of narcissism. During his interrogations, he spoke about his fame as if it were a shield, suggesting that the pressure of his million-follower reach had somehow forced his hand. He painted a picture of himself as a man pushed to the brink by Anna's alleged infidelity, though the digital evidence told a different story. The incriminating audio he claimed to have heard, the sounds he used to justify the double execution, contained nothing more than two people talking and laughing. In Ali's distorted reality, a wife's laughter in the presence of another man was a capital offense. The forensic team also recovered a video from Ali's phone that chilled even the most seasoned officers to the bone. Moments after the shots were fired, while the air in the living room was still heavy with the smell of cordite, Ali had stood over the bodies and hit record. He captured the raw, unedited carnage of his handiwork. There was no remorse in the footage, only a sense of grim satisfaction. He had sent this video to his mother, a move that investigators interpreted as a final desperate attempt to seek validation for his actions. To Ali, the world was a stage, and even a double murder was a scene that required a record for his audience. The ballistic evidence was equally damning. The handgun recovered from Ali's vehicle matched the shell casings found at the spire. The trajectory of the bullets confirmed that the victims had been caught completely off guard. Rayburn Barron had been shot 3 times at close range, while Anna had been killed by a single clinical shot to the head. There was no evidence of a struggle, no defensive wounds on either victim, and no signs that they had even seen Ali coming before the lead started flying. It was an ambush in every sense of the word. As the detectives worked to build the timeline, they utilized the Spire's extensive security camera network. The footage showed Ali entering the building with a purpose that belied his cocaine-induced state. He didn't look like a man in a panic, he looked like a man going to work. He moved through the lobby with a calm, practiced gait, utilizing his key fob with an efficiency that showed he still considered himself the master of that domain. The cameras caught him in the elevator, staring at his reflection, perhaps checking his mask one last time before the final performance. The coldness of his movements on tape served as a powerful counter-narrative to his later claims of emotional distress. The social media aspect of the case added a layer of modern complexity that the investigators had rarely seen. Thousands of people who had followed Jinn Kid began to flood the department's tip lines and social media pages. Some were fans in denial, while others provided screenshots of Ali's increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to the murders. They described live streams where he seemed glassy-eyed and aggressive, and posts that hinted at a dark, possessive streak. This digital crowdsourcing of the investigation helped the police understand the psychological state of the killer. It became clear that Ali had been spiraling in public for months, using his platform to vent his frustrations and signal his intent to anyone who was paying close enough attention. The investigation also touched on the tragic reality of domestic violence. Detectives reviewed the previous calls to the apartment, finding a pattern of escalating abuse that Anna had tried to escape. They found that she had reached out to friends, expressing her fear that Ali was going crazy and that he wouldn't let her go. This context was crucial. It proved that the murders weren't an isolated incident, but the predictable endpoint of a cycle of control and intimidation. Anna hadn't just been a victim of a shooting, she had been a prisoner of a digital star who couldn't handle the loss of his most important follower. By the time the file was handed over to the district attorney, the case against Ali Abulban was a mountain of ironclad evidence. They had the confession, the murder weapon, the eyewitness accounts of the building staff, the security footage, the daughter's testimony regarding the iPad spy, and the horrific video Ali took of the bodies. But more than that, they had the why. They had the story of a man who had become so addicted to the artificial validation of the internet that he had lost the ability to distinguish between a like and a life. The investigation had successfully pulled back the curtain on the Jinn Kid persona, revealing a small, violent man who had traded his family's future for a final, horrific moment of control. As the detectives closed their notebooks, the Spire remained a silent sentinel over San Diego. The luxury apartment 3502 was no longer a home, but a sterile capsule of a tragedy that had been broadcast, monitored, and executed through the very devices that were supposed to connect us. The investigation was over, but the digital echo of Ali Abulban's paranoia would remain, a haunting reminder that in the age of the influencer, the most dangerous masks are the ones we wear for ourselves. The trial of Ali Abulban was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a final, desperate performance by a man who refused to cede the spotlight. As he sat at the defense table, the Jinn Kid persona occasionally flickered back to life, though now it was twisted by a volatile, unscripted rage. Throughout the hearings, Abulban frequently interrupted the proceedings with emotional outbursts, at one point shouting that he was the true victim in this tragedy. He attempted to argue that his drug-induced paranoia and the betrayal he perceived through the listening device on his daughter's iPad should mitigate his guilt. However, the prosecution remained unmoved, presenting the jury with the undeniable evidence of his meticulous stalking and the clinical nature of the executions. The most damning moment arrived when the jury was shown the video Ali had recorded of the bodies, a piece of evidence that stripped away any pretense of a man in shock. In May 2024, the jury reached a swift verdict, finding Ali Abulban guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. During the sentencing phase, the judge's words were as sharp as the bullets Ali had fired. He described the defendant as a man whose narcissism had reached a level of profound depravity. In June 2024, Ali was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 50 years for the firearm enhancements. As he was led away in shackles, the digital star was finally silenced, facing a reality where there are no likes, no followers, and no way to edit the consequences of his horrific choices. The Spire. San Diego stands as a silent witness to a life traded for a digital phantom. Anna Abulban and Rayburn Barron were not characters in a skit. They were vibrant souls whose light was extinguished by a man who couldn't separate his brand from his pulse. Ali Abulban remains behind bars, his millions of likes replaced by the cold tally of prison days. The Jinn Kid is gone, leaving only a haunting lesson. When we live for an audience, we risk losing the humanity that makes us real. If you are finished watching, you're a real true crime fan. Subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. See you in the next video.